So we are at the conclusive moment of this afternoon, and I am very glad to give the floor to Professor Diane Ring, Interim Dean of Faculty, Professor of Law at Boston College Law, for the conclusive remarks. Diane, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Costa. So what I'd like to do, we've had a very, very full set of panels. You really our first day. So remember, we have day 2 tomorrow. I'm going to talk for a moment about that. But our 3 panels really highlighted some connected but distinct issues. One is looking closely at the role of whistleblowers. The second is thinking about information during times of crisis, so disinformation, misinformation in crisis, and then now our recent panel, closing panel on the corporate world. And I think I'd like to start by really encouraging us to think as we close out today and think about what we've seen and sort of prepare for tomorrow, to really recognize that a focus on really dealing with misinformation, disinformation is the kind of question that touches many, many levels across many types of information with different actors and different sort of topical areas. And so one of the things I want to do now is think a little bit about what are some of the recommendations we might imagine? What are some of the takeaways going forward for those of us who are concerned about the issues articulated today? Where do you begin to imagine reform action steps? And it's really all over the place. It is absolutely clear there is no one action, no one arena, no one level or actor that we would be interested in looking at, but rather many. And so I thought I would just kind of provide some sort of grouped observations to kind of, sort of illustrate that. So first, as we were thinking about whistleblowers, which came up first at the beginning in our first panel, but was a theme in other ones, and even just now our corporate panel looking at sort of bad corporate actors, we saw how important whistleblowers are, but for them to do their job, right? Really, they need pathways to report. And we've seen that, we've talked about that before in other settings, but it remains a centerpiece, pathways to report, often to report anonymously. And I think one of the things that came out today, both in the first and the third panel, was timely reporting, the ability to sort of have almost an emergency level speed for certain kinds of whistleblowing issues being taken up and being expeditiously addressed by regulators. And so while there are many pieces of sort of regimes that are going to sort of support whistleblowers in the act of whistleblowing and getting action undertaken, timeliness, potentially anonymity, and sort of a quick response is going to be really important. And as we talked about earlier in the day, funding. And this came up even at the very end, thinking about regulatory bodies responding to Takata, for example. If you are an underfunded regulatory agency in a country, you really may not be able to adequately take even some of the information and begin to protect your community. We also looked, at some issues that I really think could be grouped under the idea of training. So one is sort of actually I should step back, whistleblowers and facilitating the reporting. And then of course, with respect to whistleblowers, facilitating their ability to do so and remain employed, not suffer undue personal consequences, extreme retaliation. And we've talked a bit about what those supports can look like, being both part of a legal framework, but also softer sort of infrastructure supports, whether it's opportunities to get advice, guidance, legal support from nonprofits, social media, etc. Next, though, I want to identify a number of ideas that I think fit under the idea of training, right? That with increased ability for information to be spread globally and quickly, the need for actors at all levels, including the end consumer, to really be better trained to think about the nature of the information that they're seeing, passing on, reporting, posting, right? How to really assess the quality, the support for that data. the preventative measures, right, that a number of our panelists really talked about. So how do we sort of visit, and one phrase is build resilience for a community worldwide of users of information. And there are different groups that sort of do work on that kind of training at the individual or kind of end user level, but we've also seen, sort of continued reference to the idea of sort of platforms and others continuing to play an active role in verifying and source checking. And I do think that, two ideas, two themes to worry about in this context that have come up is we don't want to go towards censorship. So how do we maintain a really rigorous approach to data and information without censorship, but also at the same time looking towards increased capacity of technology and the issues of deep fakes, which really compound our concerns with misinformation. The next theme that came up in a number of these and a number of our panels and the conversations was trust building. And this was trust of the community in the government, in political officials, in public statements of, whether it's about health and safety from scientists, right? Sort of the idea that trust in society is critical in not only countering misinformation, but also ensuring that people sort of are willing to embrace verified information coming from sources that have really outlined and provide the transparency. And so I think that's a sort of, how do you build trust? Not easy. It takes time. It's not just about disinformation. It's part of a broader social and cultural dynamic in any jurisdiction. But transparency is obviously going to be part of that process and something that should be front and center on the minds of governments, agencies, public officials. Cyber war in war, right? A related but kind of slightly different theme. And I thought this, two big things that came out of this is not to underestimate it, right? And not to imagine it, that many actors aren't able to engage, and then to think about how to respond. It's complex. If it's war, there are weapons, and suddenly, well, is information a positive weapon or a negative? How do we assess it in that context? And so no clear answers for all that, but clearly an important topic. And then when we talked about misinformation in the financial system, here it was very interesting to look at the link between a word we hadn't been talking about yet, which was misperception, and then misinformation, and thinking about the sort of misinformation is having potentially slightly different sources and clearly complex. First of all, we're talking about complex financial systems, complex risks, and the ability of many sort of end users of this information, financial information, to really assess what they're seeing. And how do you combat misperceptions that essentially lead to misinformation and poor decision making? And again, understanding that that's out there, being able to figure out where and when it's happening, where the risks are greatest. The suggestions here, have really looked at sort of providing additional information, but of course it has to be thoughtfully executed, not to provide that additional overload that it means that at the end of the day, the end users of this financial data can't really decipher sort of what's in front of them and really figure out their true risks. Next topic I just wanted to highlight was data protection. Again, these are all about the misuse or problems with data in different arenas. Data protection, really an interesting issue because it raises, two really different questions. One is the legal frame. And so we saw that in the Cambridge Analytica discussion, thinking about the legal frame and the reality that we do have a patchwork of regulation about data protection. It's not obviously global. And the US is a major player in the business side, right? We have a lot of the data related platforms and businesses, but obviously not part of the EU's data protection system. And what gaps does that create, and what kinds of maybe coordination would we want to or need to see there to minimize those gaps? The other sort of side of data protection was tech solutions, and that I have to say, it really, really challenging. To the extent tech solutions are those that require, again, I'm thinking of especially end users, the regular person, to sort of implement, probably is not you might want to make those tools certainly available, but whether or not we can think about that as a realistic response to serious data protection issues is obviously pretty unlikely. They're not typically going to be sophisticated enough to know how, maybe, and when, or to appreciate when they're at risk. And finally, just sort of highlighting the issue of corporations and misinformation or suppression of information, which I think was really apparent in our third panel. Here we see essentially, the incentives and the pressures to create corporate profits running headlong against the duty or obligation to not hide information, and certainly not to provide false information. And our two case studies in the third panel on that, global, enormous scale. These are not one-offs, they're not small. And there's a real challenge here because the pressure, and as I said, the enticement of profit, drives people's choices. And here again, we saw the role of whistleblowers sort of in the middle as a moment to sort of provide a check on some of those corporate activities. I think one of the big themes that came out of that was the importance of a quick response, an ability for whistleblowers in these contexts, particularly where health and safety, both personal and the environment, are at risk, to be able to share their information quickly and easily, and have it acted upon. And so that has, again, back to that timeliness in a whistleblower regime, no delays, as well as sufficient enforcement capacity. Looking ahead to tomorrow. So this was merely day one. Tomorrow, we have several more panels that I think you're going to find are a really great build upon today. And first, I wanted you to note that there is a separate link for tomorrow's panels. So day two is a separate link. It's available on the website, and it might also be showing up now. And Costa, did we have did you want me to respond to a question? I just saw, no.
Thank you very much, Diane, for this insightful conclusions. Yes, I think that we can pause the recording now, and we can